Have you maybe reflected on your leadership style moving forward?
No, my plan is to continue to lead and be the only leader in the country that's fighting for an affordable Canada, where our people who work hard can afford a home and food. That is my agenda.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre this week saying he has no plans to change tax. Those were the first comments from Poilievre in the wake of announcements from two Conservative MPs that they're leaving. Minutes after the Liberals tabled their federal budget earlier this month, Tory MP Chris D'Entremont announced he was crossing the floor. His reason for jumping ship, he said in part, Poilievre's leadership style. 2 days later, Conservative Matt Genereux announced he would resign as an MP altogether. Our Sunday strategy session is here to talk about all of that. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and Director of Communications to the late Jack Layton. Kory Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst as well as former Communications Director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody.
Hey there.
So a week ago, we were talking about the events, Scott, that occurred, and we had yet to hear from Mr. Poilievre. This week, he finally responded. What do you make of what he said, how he said it, and what it says about the future of his leadership?
Well, it says a lot, I think. It says a lot. Poilievre stands in front of a crowd, in front of the country, through the microphone and the camera, and declares, I've given it careful consideration, and I have concluded that I am flawless, that voters erred, and I need to fix nothing about myself. And I just think it's obviously a ridiculous look. And if his impulse, if his goal is to signal strength, it does the exact opposite. It just spotlights his insecurity. Nothing is more unattractive. Nothing strikes a stranger tone than someone who says, I got nothing wrong with me. I need to make no corrections, no fixes whatsoever. And then proceeds to blame everyone else for his problems, including the media who report the defection of two members of parliament. And so, this is literally more of the same. It's self-declared more of the same. And, Pierre Poilievre needs to have an honest look in the mirror at the polls and ask himself, why are MPs leaving my party? Why am I trailing Mark Carney consistently for months as preferred prime minister? And what do I need to do to remedy that? And he is not going to get it as long as he clings to this brosphere, masculine nonsense where he says, all is great, I am perfect, and the world is wrong.
My sense is that, the Poilievre camp, and Kory, you can explain this better than me, would say, okay, that's what the Scott Reids of Canada think, but I'm not sure our supporters and the people who came out for us in the election want me to be as magnanimous as the Scott Reids do. Do you think that's accurate, and do you think it serves them?
Well, I think it's accurate that your hardcore super fans will tend to agree that there's nothing that needs adjusting, and they're not looking for contrition on any of these things. I think that's true. But I don't think that that's enough people to win an election is the issue. Right now, Poilievre continues to trail his party in popularity. And the sort of mean girls, acidic apple eating kind of style that he brings to media relations at times, I don't think makes him more likable. I think it makes him less likable. So I don't get the strategy, and I don't get the tactics in doing that. And I just don't see what's gained by acting like a jerk, frankly.
Kathleen, it's interesting because this press conference was an example of the type of Poilievre we had become accustomed to through the election and prior, really. But there were moves made by Poilievre and the people around him to try and augment that image in the last few months, in particular since he came back into the House of Commons, engaging mainstream media in a very different way, including this program, including on the CBC. Yeah. So you do see the tension of the two things kind of play out publicly. What do you think? What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, it's almost like, who was the briefer for this last press conference? Because it's not the same communications press officer that's been briefing him for the last few months since the election. It's a very different tactic. He's not engaging, he's just counter-striking. And that's what he used to do prior to Justin Trudeau and before he resigned and into the last election. And so, I do agree with Scott. Did he learn any of those lessons? Frankly, attacking the media, is the political equivalent of essentially like pulling the fire alarm. I got nothing else to say, I got to get out of here. And that was a huge mistake. And so you wonder, you know, if I'm going to be charitable and give some points to Mr. Poilievre, I would say, hey, you know, he was trying in an effort to not give more oxygen to the floor crosser story. You know, yeah, you get some communication points for that, but not in how he executed it. Because it just turned everyone off by being that same aggressive, angry, negative, and then to go further by attacking the media was just too much.
Okay, I want to switch gears because there was another big announcement a day or two later, and that's around the second tranche, Scott, of major projects, everything from LNG to a nickel mine in Ontario to a tungsten mine that was initially approved 10 years ago in New Brunswick. What political purpose do you think the government hopes this serves for them, and do you think they deliver on it?
Well, you know, I've been kind of critical of the government when it comes to broad communications efforts, their ability to establish a story and reinforce a story. And I will say, forget the substance of it. We'll see what projects manifest themselves and, you know, what actually is realized in terms of going to market. But from a comms perspective, I think it did work. And I think their political objective was pretty plain. They want to reinforce the idea and communicate the idea that they have a plan. So you announce these, you leak them for a couple of days. I thought you could see some careful media management for a couple of days in advance. They leaked out a couple of the projects that made certain that they had headlines for 2-3 days in advance. Then you have the Prime Minister making the argument. They're there with a backdrop of a previously greenlit project. And, you know, you're talking about LNG exports and the jobs and the GDP that generates. So I think they had 3 or 4 days of telling the same consistent story, which is, you know, focused on, we're going to create jobs, we're going to build things, we're going to protect our economy and protect your job. And I think that makes a lot of sense. They obviously have to deliver on the policy, but as a matter of political communication, I thought it was one of the best 4 or 5 day stretches they've had since Carney became Prime Minister.
I do think at some point the execution part of the story, Kory, is going to be important. I would note that, like, I find it fascinating that none of the projects they've announced so far actually need C5. And they're not deemed in the national interest, which means that the list is still mitigating political risk. They're not spending a ton of political capital on it yet.
Yeah, it's hard to see a lot of these projects as being, quote, major, like, and many of them not even new. So I think it's a bit underwhelming, frankly, and you know, and we still haven't gotten an answer to the big questions. You know, I noted the Prime Minister spoke about, you know, working on a deal with Alberta and the pipelines are somewhere in the works. Well, you know, I think there'll be a lot of pressure on them until those truly major projects get announced. Like, but you know, re-announcing mines that were, you know, selected years ago and projects that really don't need the major projects office in order to proceed. I don't know. It just seems like it's not huge news, frankly.
Well, I think that the interesting thing is going to be, like, at what point do they start expending, I think, a lot of political capital that Mark Carney has, right? Yeah. Is it going to be on this MOU with Alberta? Is it going to be around a pipeline? Because that is a very different type of project, requires, you know, getting rid of laws that are very significant versus these, which are not nothing. And I understand the communications thing that Scott's pointing out, it's entirely true, but they're not the same thing as a controversial resource project.
I mean, getting the MOU would be a win, I think, for the federal government, because it essentially would stop the kind of Alberta versus the feds narrative, right? It would bring Alberta into the tent, force them to stop opposing, and also get them to sign on to their regulatory and say yes to projects. I think, though, the problem really is, putting aside whether the policy and the economic will drive the economic engine of Canada, I don't think politically they have the persuasion, or the risk lies in the political rollout, I think, of this kind of stuff. Because, sure, let's talk about the BC North transmission line. How does that relate to folks in Surrey City Centre, you know? Right. Or let's talk about the New Brunswick mine that you just mentioned. How does that help folks in downtown St. John? I don't know if Carney has an answer for that yet. And I think there lies a lot of the political risk that this government's failed to address so far.
I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it as always. Kathleen Monk, Scott Reid, and Kory Teneycke, our Sunday strategy session. When we come back, what's the biggest national security threat facing this country? The head of Canada's spy agency, CSIS Director Daniel Rogers, is my next guest, and I'm going to ask him exactly that.